Two names. Two eras. One rivalry the world was never meant to see. Chuck Norris, the man whose name became a symbol of invincibility. Michael Jai White, the warrior whose skills silenced rooms before he ever raised his voice. For years, fans argued online. Old school versus new school. Legend versus real fighter. Who would really win? But here's the truth no one expected. There was something deeper than competition. Something hidden behind studio doors, unspoken agreements, and quiet respect. It all started with whispers. Whenever a journalist tried to ask Chuck Norris about Michael Jai White, the question was quickly redirected. Whenever Michael was asked about Chuck, his answer was calm, almost guarded. No trash talk. No challenges. No ego-fueled interviews. And that silence. It wasn't accidental. Inside Hollywood, producers loved one thing more than talent: conflict. They wanted headlines. They wanted controversy. They wanted a who's better narrative to sell tickets and clicks. But with Chuck Norris and Michael Jai White, something strange happened. The rivalry never went public. No press conference. No verbal jabs. No staged face-offs. Fans thought it meant avoidance. Some even said fear. But those closest to the industry knew this wasn't fear. This was control. Chuck Norris had spent decades building an image of discipline, honor, and restraint. Michael Jai White had spent his life training not just his body, but his mind. Both men understood something the audience didn't yet see. A public rivalry would cheapen the art. Yet still, rumors refused to die. A stunt coordinator once whispered, if they ever shared a room, the air changed. A producer claimed, there was one meeting where everyone stopped talking when they both walked in. No shouting. No threats. Just presence. And presence, when real, is louder than noise. People expected tension. They expected dominance. They expected one man to prove himself over the other. Instead, they witnessed something unsettling: mutual awareness. As if both men recognized something familiar in the other. Not weakness. Not competition. But discipline. The kind forged in years of pain, sacrifice, and quiet mastery. This wasn't the story of two fighters racing toward a clash. This was the story of a rivalry that never exploded. Because it was never built on hatred. And that's why the truth behind Chuck Norris versus Michael Jai White is far more shocking than any fight the world imagined. Backhand index pointing right. Before we continue, comment below. Are you watching for the legend, or for the warrior? And tell me where you're watching from. Oncoming fist. Long before the internet decided to compare them, Chuck Norris and Michael Jai White were walking very different paths. Paths that would eventually place them in the same conversation, even if neither of them ever asked to be there. Chuck Norris came from an era where martial arts were still misunderstood in the West. He wasn't just fighting opponents, he was fighting stereotypes. Karate was seen as a novelty, not a discipline. Chuck changed that. Tournament by tournament, he built a reputation not through loud words, but through relentless consistency. He didn't just win, he dominated with control, precision, and restraint. His power came from discipline, not rage. By the time Hollywood noticed him, Chuck had already earned respect in real fighting circles. The screen was just another platform. Every role he took carried the same message: strength without chaos, confidence without arrogance. Audiences didn't just watch Chuck Norris, they believed him. Years later, Michael Jai White was growing up in a different world. Martial arts were no longer new, but they were fragmented. Flashy styles overshadowed substance. Michael trained in multiple disciplines: karate, taekwondo, jiu-jitsu, boxing, not to show off, but to understand combat completely. His body became a weapon, but his mind remained calm. Michael didn't rush fame. He earned it slowly, roll by roll, bruise by bruise. On set, stunt teams noticed something unusual. He didn't fake movements. He corrected choreography. He respected every fighter, regardless of rank. People who sparred with him left quieter than when they arrived. By the time Michael's name began circulating in Hollywood action circles, Chuck Norris was already a legend. And that's where the comparison machine began working overtime. Executives loved the contrast. Old master versus new powerhouse. Classic discipline versus modern explosiveness. But behind the scenes, the tone was different. Whenever Chuck's name came up in casting discussions involving Michael, there was hesitation. Not rejection, hesitation. The kind that comes from respect, not doubt. Studios understood that placing these two men in direct opposition wasn't just risky, it was unnecessary. They didn't need a manufactured feud. The comparison alone created heat. At private industry gatherings, both men were present, rarely in the same room, but always aware of each other. Chuck observed quietly. Michael listened more than he spoke. Neither tried to dominate attention. That silence confused people who expected alpha behavior. But seasoned fighters recognized it instantly. This wasn't avoidance. This was recognition. Two warriors who understood the cost of mastery. Two men who had nothing to prove, yet everything to protect, their art, their integrity, their legacy. What the public didn't see was that the so-called rivalry wasn't born from ego. It was born from expectation. Everyone wanted a winner before a fight ever existed. And that pressure was building. Because eventually, there would come a moment when silence would no longer be enough, a moment that would force both legends to acknowledge each other directly. And when that moment arrived, the truth behind this rivalry would finally begin to surface. As the comparisons grew louder, something else began to change behind the scenes. The whispers that once floated quietly through gyms and studio hallways started turning into expectations. Producers, journalists, and even fellow actors wanted an answer to a question neither Chuck Norris nor Michael Jai White had ever asked themselves out loud. Who was better? It was a dangerous question. Not because of ego, but because of what it represented. Reducing decades of discipline, sacrifice, and mastery into a single outcome cheapened everything both men stood for. Still, Hollywood thrived on simplification. And the industry was hungry. The tension peaked during a private industry event. Not a public show, not a press conference, but a closed-door gathering attended by directors, stunt coordinators, and senior producers. These were people who understood combat beyond camera angles. People who had seen real injuries, real fear, and real control. Chuck Norris arrived first. Composed. No entourage. He greeted people with a nod, a handshake, a quiet smile. His presence didn't demand attention, it commanded it. Michael Jai White arrived later. Just as composed. Just as grounded. His walk was relaxed, his posture balanced. Those who noticed him also noticed something else. The room felt different. Not louder. Heavier. For a while, the two legends remained on opposite sides of the room. They didn't avoid each other, but they didn't rush either. Fighters understand timing. So do masters. Then someone made the mistake. A producer, half joking and fully ignorant of the weight of his words, laughed and said, "So, if you two ever went at it, who walks out?" The laughter that followed was forced. The silence that came after was real. Chuck didn't respond. He simply turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Michael didn't smile. He didn't frown. He stayed still. That moment told everyone everything. This wasn't about proving dominance. This was about respect being tested. Michael finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. Winning isn't always about hitting harder. Chuck looked at him, not with challenge, but with recognition. "Discipline doesn't age," he replied. "Only ego does." The room went quiet again. Those two sentences carried more weight than any fight ever could. From that moment on, the energy shifted. The idea of a rivalry stopped feeling entertaining and started feeling inappropriate. Some people sensed they had crossed an invisible line. Others didn't care. Controversy sells. But what followed couldn't be controlled. Word of the exchange spread quietly. Not to tabloids, but to people who mattered, trainers, fighters, coordinators. And among them, the reaction was unanimous. This wasn't a rivalry fueled by hate. This was a mirror. Michael had spent years proving himself in silence, often overlooked, often underestimated. Chuck had spent decades defending an art from being turned into spectacle. Both had been misunderstood in different ways. Both had endured judgment from people who never stepped onto a mat. And now, The industry wanted to pit them against each other like characters in a script. That pressure didn't explode, it condensed. Every future interview carried an unspoken tension. Every casting rumor added fuel. Fans speculated. Comment sections turned into battlefields. People who had never trained debated technique like experts. Chuck saw it. Michael felt it. And still, neither man took the bait. Because they knew something the world didn't yet understand. The real conflict wasn't between them. It was between honor and hype. Sooner or later, that conflict would force a moment of clarity, a moment where the truth behind this so-called rivalry would finally be revealed. And when that happened, the answer wouldn't satisfy those looking for a fight. It would silence them. The moment everyone had speculated about for years didn't happen under bright lights or flashing cameras. There was no announcement, no crowd, no build-up designed for drama. Like most things involving true masters, it happened quietly, almost invisibly. It was late evening after a long day on set. The location was neutral, professional, and closed to outsiders. Crew members were packing equipment, conversations were low, and the energy in the room was relaxed. Both Chuck Norris and Michael Jai White were present, though few people noticed at first. When they did, the atmosphere shifted. Not with fear. With awareness. Chuck stood near a wall, arms relaxed, posture straight. Age had touched him, but not his presence. His movements were economical, deliberate. Every gesture had purpose, nothing wasted. He watched the room the way a seasoned fighter watches an opponent, calmly, without tension. Michael entered moments later. No rush. No show. His steps were light, his balance centered. Those who had trained could see it instantly. This was a man whose body listened to his mind. He scanned the room briefly, then his eyes met Chuck's. There it was. Not a stare-down. Not a challenge. A recognition. Neither man spoke at first. Silence filled the space between them, but it wasn't awkward. It was respectful. The kind of silence that only exists between people who understand the same language without words. Chuck was the first to break it. "You move with control," he said simply. Michael nodded. "I learned early that power without control is noise." That was it. No boasting. No posturing. Just truth. They stepped aside, away from the remaining crew. What followed wasn't an argument or a negotiation, it was a conversation. Not about fame. Not about money. About training, discipline, and the responsibility that comes with being watched by millions. Chuck spoke about the early days, when martial arts were treated like a gimmick. When studios wanted flash instead of fundamentals. When respect had to be earned the hard way. Michael listened carefully. Then he spoke about modern times, about how speed and spectacle often overshadow depth. About how real fighters were pressured to perform rather than represent. At one point, Michael said, people want to see who's better. They forget why we started. Chuck nodded slowly. Because they confuse fighting with violence. That sentence hung in the air. Nearby, a few crew members noticed the exchange but couldn't hear the words. What they saw instead was body language, open stances, relaxed shoulders, steady eye contact. No tension. No rivalry. Only mutual grounding. The industry had expected sparks. What it witnessed was alignment. Chuck never challenged Michael. Michael never tried to impress Chuck. There was no need. Instead, Chuck offered something unexpected, guidance. Not in the form of instruction, but perspective. He spoke about protecting the art, about choosing roles carefully, about never letting ego dictate decisions. Michael accepted it with humility. Not submission, respect. By the time the conversation ended, the air felt lighter. As if something heavy had been resolved without force. When they returned to the room, those watching sensed it immediately. The tension they expected was gone. What replaced it was unsettling in a different way. Because if there was no rivalry, what had everyone been fighting over? That night, no announcements were made. No photos were taken. No stories leaked, at least not to the public. But among those who witnessed it, one truth became clear. The so-called rivalry had never been real. It was a projection, built by outsiders, fueled by comparison, sustained by noise. And now, with a single quiet encounter, it had begun to dissolve. What remained was something far more powerful than competition. Respect. And in the next moment, the one the public would finally hear about, that respect would be revealed in a way no one expected. 4 years, the world had been chasing a clash that was never meant to happen. Fans imagined it. Comment sections demanded it. Media outlets hinted at it with carefully chosen words. Chuck Norris versus Michael Jai White, legend versus modern master. A rivalry built entirely on speculation. But the truth, when it finally surfaced, didn't explode. It unfolded. The reveal didn't come from a headline or a viral interview. It came quietly, through people who were close enough to see past the noise. Producers, stunt coordinators, and trainers who understood what both men truly stood for. The first crack in the illusion appeared when a former studio executive spoke off the record. He admitted that multiple times, scripts had been pitched with one goal in mind, forcing a symbolic passing of the torch moment between Chuck and Michael. Not a respectful collaboration, a confrontation. Every time, the project stalled. People assumed it was scheduling conflicts or budget issues. That was the convenient story. The real reason was far more telling. Chuck Norris had declined every offer that framed Michael Jai White as an opponent rather than an equal. He refused to be part of anything that turned martial arts into a circus. According to those present in the meetings, his stance was clear: if it's built on disrespect, I'm not interested. At the same time, Michael was doing something equally unexpected. When approached with projects designed to provoke comparison or challenge Chuck's legacy, he walked away. No public statements. No complaints. Just a quiet refusal. He understood what was at stake, not just careers, but credibility. This was the truth no one expected. There was no rivalry. There was a mutual defense of honor. Behind closed doors, Chuck had even spoken in Michael's favor. He acknowledged Michael's discipline, his authenticity, and his refusal to fake skill for the camera. In an industry where shortcuts were common, that mattered. Michael, on the other hand, never once tried to replace Chuck. He openly credited pioneers like him for making space in Hollywood for martial artists who were more than just actors pretending to fight. What fans mistook for tension was actually restraint. The industry wanted conflict because conflict sells. But both men understood that real warriors don't need manufactured enemies. They needed standards. The reveal became undeniable when a respected stunt coordinator finally said it out loud during a private panel: there was never bad blood. There was protection. Protection of the art. Protection of legacy. Protection of truth. That statement spread quietly but powerfully. It reframed everything. The awkward silences, the avoided questions, the lack of public interaction, none of it was fear or avoidance. It was intention. Chuck Norris wasn't guarding his throne. Michael Jai White wasn't trying to take it. They were guarding something bigger than either of them. Martial arts had already suffered from exaggeration, ego, and spectacle. Both men had seen techniques turned into tricks and discipline reduced to choreography. They refused to add to that damage. And in doing so, they disappointed people who wanted drama. But they earned something far more valuable: respect from those who truly understood. When the truth finally reached the fans, reactions were mixed. Some were confused. Some were relieved. Others were disappointed that the fantasy of rivalry had been taken away. Yet for those who paid attention, the message was clear. The strongest fighters aren't defined by who they defeat. They're defined by what they refuse to become. Chuck Norris and Michael Jai White never needed to fight to prove anything. Their choices spoke louder than fists ever could. And that revelation changed the entire narrative. What the world thought was a rivalry was actually a quiet alliance, one built on discipline, humility, and a shared responsibility to protect the art they both loved. And with that truth finally uncovered, there was only one thing left to show the world: what real resolution looks like. Once the truth began to surface, something unexpected happened. The noise started to fade. The endless debates, the imaginary matchups, the heated arguments in comment sections slowly lost their power. Without conflict to feed on, speculation collapsed under its own weight. What remained was clarity. The resolution of the so-called rivalry didn't come through a dramatic announcement or a joint interview. It came through actions, quiet, deliberate actions that spoke louder than any public statement ever could. Not long after the truth circulated within industry circles, Chuck Norris made a decision that surprised many. He declined a high-profile project that would have placed him in symbolic opposition to a younger fighter clearly modeled after Michael Jai White. The script promised headlines and massive attention. It also promised controversy. Chuck read it once. Then he passed. To him, the message was wrong. It framed strength as domination and legacy as something to be taken rather than honored. He had spent his life teaching discipline and respect. Ending his career by fueling a false rivalry would undo everything he stood for. Michael, at the same time, was facing his own test. A studio approached him with an offer that subtly suggested he could be positioned as the man who surpassed the legends. The role came with money, visibility, and the kind of narrative the industry loved. All he had to do was accept the comparison and lean into it. Michael refused. He later explained to a close associate, "You don't stand taller by standing on someone else." That single sentence summed up everything. Instead of chasing headlines, both men chose alignment. They supported projects that highlighted discipline, authenticity, and respect for martial arts. They encouraged younger performers to train properly, to study history, and to understand that real power doesn't need constant validation. Quietly, a new standard was set. Behind the scenes, trainers began referencing both Chuck and Michael as examples of what longevity in martial arts truly looked like. Not just physical endurance, but ethical endurance, the ability to protect your values even when temptation is strong. There was one moment, rarely spoken about, that sealed the resolution completely. At a private gathering honoring contributions to martial arts in cinema, Chuck Norris was invited to speak. Many expected a nostalgic speech about the past. Instead, he talked about the future. He spoke about the responsibility of veterans to guide, not compete with, the next generation. He spoke about the danger of turning discipline into spectacle. And then, without naming names directly, he acknowledged performers who carried the art forward with humility and depth. Those who knew understood exactly who he was talking about. Michael Jai White was in the audience. He didn't stand. He didn't wave. He simply nodded. A quiet gesture of respect returned. That was the resolution. No trophy exchanged. No dramatic embrace. No staged unity for cameras. Just acknowledgement. From that point on, the narrative finally changed. Fans who truly listened began to see the bigger picture. The rivalry they had argued over for years had never been real. It was a story built for entertainment, not truth. The truth was far more meaningful. Two warriors from different eras chose principle over pride. They refused to let their names be used to divide, provoke, or distort the values they had spent their lives building. And in doing so, they taught a lesson far more powerful than any on-screen fight. That legacy is not about winning over others. It's about remaining true to yourself. As the industry moved on and new names rose, the example set by Chuck Norris and Michael Jai White continued to influence those paying attention. Young fighters learned that respect could coexist with confidence. That humility was not weakness. That silence, sometimes, was the strongest statement of all. The rivalry ended the moment it was understood. What replaced it was something rare in a world driven by noise. Integrity. And with that integrity firmly established, only one chapter remained, the lesson this story was always meant to teach. The story of Chuck Norris and Michael Jai White isn't about who could throw the hardest punch, land the fastest kick, or win a hypothetical fight. It's about something much deeper, the unseen battles fought in discipline, respect, and integrity. That's the real lesson that emerged from a rivalry that never existed. For years, fans argued, compared, and speculated. Comment sections became battlegrounds. Headlines asked questions that demanded conflict. Yet, behind the noise, two men quietly refused to play the game. Not out of fear, but out of principle. True strength, they showed, isn't measured by the defeat of others. It's measured by the ability to rise above temptation, to act rightly even when the world expects drama. Both men had the skill to dominate any arena, the fame to command attention, and the pressure to entertain a hungry audience. Yet, they chose restraint. Chuck Norris built his legend not on arrogance, but on consistency. Every fight he took, every role he played, reflected discipline, patience, and respect for his art. Michael Jai White followed a similar path, learning multiple martial arts disciplines, refining his mind as much as his body, and refusing to compromise authenticity for spectacle. The rivalry was a projection, created by outsiders who wanted drama, clicks, and profit. The truth, the real story, was the quiet alignment of two warriors who understood what mattered most. One looked to the past. One represented the present. Together, they honored the craft and refused to let it be cheapened. At a private gathering, years after whispers began circulating, Chuck acknowledged the next generation of martial artists. Without naming Michael directly, he praised those who honored discipline, respected tradition, and acted with humility. Michael, present in the audience, responded with a quiet nod. That simple gesture, subtle, silent, powerful, symbolized the resolution of what the world misunderstood as rivalry. It was a lesson for everyone watching. Respect doesn't require enemies. Recognition doesn't require competition. Power doesn't require dominance. True power is silent. True respect is earned, not demanded. And real warriors understand that protecting the art is more important than proving themselves to outsiders. This is not just a story about martial arts. It's a story about life. Too often, people judge others based on appearances, achievements, or status. Too often, society expects conflict, drama, or comparison. But the strongest individuals, the ones who leave lasting legacies, rise above those expectations. They don't engage in meaningless battles. They stand firm in principle and let their actions speak. For Chuck and Michael, that meant never letting a manufactured rivalry define them. It meant refusing roles that would force disrespect. It meant guiding the next generation through example rather than spectacle. And it meant silently showing the world that discipline, humility, and integrity outweigh any fleeting clash of egos. The public may never fully understand the restraint it took. They may never realize the quiet choices that defined both men's careers. But the lesson is clear. We often chase drama when the real power lies in composure. We often look for conflict when the real strength is in respect. And we often measure success by defeating others, when the true measure is remaining true to ourselves. Chuck Norris and Michael Jai White didn't need a fight to prove anything. Their choices, their silence, and their mutual respect spoke louder than any punch or kick ever could. And that is the legacy that will endure far beyond headlines, comment wars, or viral speculation. Type respect in the comments if you believe humility is true strength. And tell me where you're watching from. I want to see every kind soul who understands real power.